It would be an understatement to say that Nikon's announcement of their first full-frame mirrorless bodies was highly anticipated, especially after a needlessly long month of video teasers. So once they officially revealed to the public the Z6 and Z7 bodies, hundreds of hands-on reports were rapidly published on the web. I went through a huge amount of those. There were some positive things that emerged, including the quality of the viewfinder and the video capabilities. However, even though they would not put it in so many words because so far they only had access to pre-production units and they want to reserve judgment for the final product, the overall conclusions were filled with a lot of disappointment. Of course, the more you hype your camera, the more likely you are to disappoint when you finally reveal it. However, in this case, it seems to go much further than that. On the surface, the Z6 is more or less a mirrorless version of the D750, while the Z7 is more or less a mirrorless version of the D850. In terms of specs and pricing, the Z6 and Z7 are clearly positioned against the Sony a7 III and a7R III. But when you look below the surface, things quickly start to unravel. The biggest complaint that keeps on coming back in everybody's report is that the Z6 and Z7 will only have one slot for an XQD card. It is true that in 2018 people have become used to redundancies, and if you are a professional shooter, then given the option, the only business decision you can make is to go for the safety of a dual slot. Of course, when people were shooting film or in the earlier generations of digital bodies, pros were doing just fine without the dual card slot. But what I'm saying is that given the option, then as a professional you have to protect your business. And nowadays you have the choice. If you are a Nikon shooter, you have a dual card slot in the D850, for example. That's the issue I read the most about, but many others were also reported. I won't go into much details for those, but they include the blackout periods when shooting in continuous mode, some issues with the autofocus system and the lack of eye detect autofocus, the slow frames per second you get in reality when shooting in continuous mode if you don't want to lock the exposure at your first image, the selection of lenses that will be available in the beginning. Of course, it's going to take time for Nikon to produce more native lenses for the Z series bodies, but launching the Z6 and Z7 with f1.8 as fastest primes available is a legitimate disappointment given the emphasis that was put on the bigger Z mount. And potentially a weak battery life, although keep in mind that usually the CPA readings are on the conservative side of things. Having said all that, I haven't found anybody talking about the real issue with the Z6 and Z7 bodies. Forget about all the technical things and specifications. Where Nikon really dropped the ball is with ergonomics. If they wanted the Z6 and Z7 to frontally compete with the Sony a7 III and a7R III, then ergonomics was really the area where Nikon could have destroyed Sony. Nikon has a long history of making cameras and has many Nikon photographers who are used to the Nikon ergonomics. All they needed was to offer Nikon shooters the same experience with the Z6 and Z7 that they have with their DSLR bodies. And yes, the menus in the Z6 and Z7 are very similar to what you will find in the menus of a Nikon DSLR. However, once you have to dig into the menus, you have already lost the ergonomics battle. Where Nikon literally dropped the ball is with the dials of these cameras. And in particular, I'm talking about the upper left dial, both on the Z6 and Z7, which are using the same dial. The way they designed this dial is very close to the one you will find on the D750, for example. So if you come from a D850, for example, you will not find the usual function button that you have currently on your camera, which means you have to learn again how to use a specific camera. But that's not the only issue. Even on the D750, below this PASM sort of dial, you will find a subdial. The subdial is used to select your shooting type: continuous high, continuous low, bracketing, quiet mode, etc. Overall, by choosing to go with the D750 type of dial rather than with the D850 type of dial, while at the same time completely removing the subdial that you currently find on both the D750 and D850, I think that Nikon has completely crippled the ergonomics of their camera. And they've made it that much more difficult for a current Nikon DSLR shooter to do the jump from their DSLR body to these mirrorless bodies without having to go through a steep learning curve. Obviously, there will be customizable buttons on the Z6 and Z7 bodies that you will be able to program to replace some of these functions that you are missing because of the lack of the subdial, but those buttons could have been better used for something else. On top of that, the two function buttons on the front of the Z6 and Z7 bodies seem to be difficult to reach for the average shooter. At the end of the day, what that means is that you will have to go into the menus of your Z6 and Z7 to change settings that probably more often than not would have been much more easier to change with a customizable button on the back of your body. Now, I don't care if Nikon's menu are good, and I don't care if, coming from a Nikon's DSLR, you already know those menus. In my opinion, as soon as you have to go through a set of menus and submenus, you are losing track with your subject, and therefore you're already losing the battle. And I think it's such a shame because winning the battle of ergonomics was such a low-hanging fruit for Nikon. I don't know why they did not come up with something better than that. My only guess is that in their mind, the Z6 and Z7 are more targeted towards enthusiast photographers, and they think that this type of photographers don't need to adjust their settings that often. Anyway, if you are a Nikon shooter, this doesn't mean that you need to sell all your Nikon gear right now and go hang yourself. It just means that this is the first generation of full-frame mirrorless camera for Nikon, and that you will have to wait for further iterations of the product to have both better performance and better ergonomics. So this is just my personal opinion about what we have seen so far from Nikon about the Z6 and Z7 bodies. You may agree, you may disagree. Please let me know in the comments, and I will talk to you soon. Thank you.